Yeah. So tonight we're going to talk about how to decode, how to read different German scripts and prints. So just to start, we'll do a question and answer session at the very end. So just hold everything till then. And we are recording this presentation, and I will email out a link to the recording later this week to everybody. And then please make sure you're muted with microphone off. We've got a lot of people in here and it can get kind of staticky. So first off, Backlog is a company that's putting this on. Backlog's my company. We really work with individuals to do genealogy stuff and then institutions for archives consulting. So we do archival needs assessments. We work with people to set up digitization plans, which is really great for smaller historical societies who don't necessarily have staff to set up projects for volunteers to execute. We also do genealogy research, which is part of this webinar. We're based in St. Louis, and we have an absolute ton of Germans who came here in the 1800s. So a lot of our clients have German genealogy. And then we also do family history projects, and that's kind of everything outside the sphere of research. So like, doing oral history interviews, putting everything together in a book, things like that. And I'm Emma. I was a university archivist for 5 years before being laid off during the pandemic, and then Backlog is my company, and I'm here with Chris, and I'll let him take it from here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Nafziger. My background is in art history and history, and I took 6 years with German back in the day, and I've traveled to Germany 5 times. I even actually lived in Germany at one point back in high school for a summer in a town called Freising in Bavaria, just north of Munich, which I'm sure you've heard of Munich before. And since moving back to St. Louis, which is where I grew up, I have become interested in the study of German-American brewing here in St. Louis, particularly the Lemp family, which you may or may not have heard of. And my knowledge of German and German scripts and type fonts has really aided me considerably in my research. And I sort of took a deep dive into the history of all of this, basically because I found a lot of interest in it. I think it would be really helpful for other people to know sort of the history and how you can recognize these type fonts. Maybe some strategies you can use to help understand what you're looking at. All right, Emma, next slide, please. So first, we're going to kind of start with a little bit of the backstory. So obviously, scripts go all the way back thousands of years, and type fonts, of course, very famously start with the Gutenberg Bible, of course, and that also very much leads into the Protestant Reformation. The Bible obviously being translated into German by Martin Luther, and of course, the Bible being printed. There obviously now were Bibles in much greater quantities than before, when Bibles had to be basically written out by hand. And as we'll discover over the course of this webinar, there was actually a lot of the reasons why scripts developed was ease of basically the scribes who were doing them. So we'll talk more about that in just a second, but realize that politics and religion actually played a very important role in all of these different historic scripts and type fonts that developed. All right, Emma, next slide. So we're going to be talking about a lot of them, and we're going to give the backstory and the history of ones that, unless you're really diving deep back into, medieval history, which maybe you are, there's a very much a possibility that maybe in your archives or your library or museum, you might actually have examples of these scripts. So it might actually come in really handy. And if you don't, and maybe you're just simply doing research on your family in the 19th century or 18th centuries, it's also good for you to understand where these scripts came from. There's a very logical progression. So we're going to be looking at Carolingian, which is it's basically the word that means having to do with Charlemagne. Now, of course, in Germany, we refer to him as Karl der Grosse, or just simply Charles the Great in English. But usually, of course, in America, we call him Charlemagne. And that leads to Blackletter or Gothic, which sometimes is referred to as Fraktur script, but I like to just differentiate it because, of course, there's Fraktur type, which we'll be talking about. And then there's Humanist Minuscule, which is technically an Italian script, but it actually was influential on the development of German script. So I wanted to talk about that briefly as well. Then we get to Kurrent, and then we'll get to Sütterlin, and then Normalschrift. Next slide, Emma, please. And then after we go through all of those scripts, we'll be talking about Textualis, and then Schwabacher, and then Fraktur. All right, next, please. So just a little bit of a brief, this is not a German grammar or a German language webinar, but I did want to just briefly speak to a couple of very common little symbols or letters that you will see appear in German a lot. And I just wanted to explain those to you just at the beginning. So if you spot these, you understand what you're seeing. The first is what's known as an umlaut. And those are those two dots over vowels. And what those are from a phonetic standpoint is the equivalent of it following with an E. And what's very important to realize is that sometimes you'll actually see in script or in type font, you'll actually see the E written out. And it can make a huge difference in the meaning of a word. Probably perhaps one of the most famous ones is the difference between the word schön and schon. So SCH umlaut O-N, schön means beautiful, while SCH-O-N means schon, which means already. Now you might be wondering, are there capital vowels that have the umlaut over them? And the answer is yes, but I want you to realize that a lot of the time in German writing and type font, you oftentimes will see a German word that it will be understood that there's an umlaut, but they will dispense with not including it. So you have to be very careful when you're reading. If you have to ask yourself, is that German word actually have an umlaut over that capital letter? And the next thing, this is an actual letter in the German alphabet. It's known as the S-set. And it looks like a B, doesn't it? It looks like perhaps a very fancy, cursive B, but it's definitely not. It is the equivalent of a double S. And of course, just like the umlaut we were just talking about, sometimes they'll just simply write it out as two S's. But realize that most of the time you will see it written as an S-set, which is basically the equivalent of two S's, or it can be written out as two S's. Also of incredible importance is that all nouns, whether common or proper, they are all capitalized in German. That is something you need to get very used to when you are looking at German language, is that all nouns are capitalized, period. All right, Emma, next slide. So let's start looking at, I think no more perfect of an example of an illustration is a depiction of a monk in a monastery, handwriting out, probably copying some famous work of maybe Greek or Roman philosophy or literature, or maybe even the Bible. Remember, everything was handwritten in what we call a scriptorium. So think about that. Think about how everything had to be hand copied. And sometimes even we think many of these people who are hand copying didn't actually even read Greek or Latin. So think about that. All right, next slide, please, Emma. So this might look really confusing, but it does give us a very clear example of how everything basically descends from everything else. So we start at the top with what's known as Trajan, which is basically the Latin alphabet. And over the course of, basically that was the 2nd century AD is when Trajan was an emperor of the Roman Empire. And it basically began to sort of what we might describe as sort of decompose. And likewise, at the same time, we had the late ancient Greek alphabet as well, which we sometimes called Koine Greek. And those all began to kind of break down into during what is called erroneously the Dark Ages, but particularly in Ireland was actually a period of a lot of learning. It's just it was not very well documented. We get down all the way then that all basically derives down to Carolingian, which we'll look at in just a second. And then during the Carolingian period, we see real proper lowercase letters develop. If you can believe that, back before in the Roman period in Latin, there were actually no lowercase letters. They all were uppercase. There were no spaces between words, and they all just flow together You got to an end of a line and you just picked up right again on the next line. All right, and then you can see it actually goes all the way down to times down at the bottom, like Times New Roman. You can see fractured, etc. All right, Emma, next slide. So let's talk about Carolingian. It developed in monasteries during the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is very important to figure to understand. He was not actually very literate himself, but he understood the importance of literacy and the revival of ancient Greek and Roman literature. So he and his advisors believed that there would be great benefit in developing a new script that was very easy to copy and to write very quickly. So you see an example of it over there on the right. And it's a very logical sort of, how would I say it, progression from ancient Latin and other scripts that existed back in the centuries before the 8th and 9th centuries. And it was a focus on clarity. You're going to be hearing me say that constantly. And what do you see here? You see that improvement of capital letters and you see lowercase letters. And also, very importantly, what do you see? You see spaces between words, which, of course, was a major invention, which sounds silly to us nowadays, but was a big deal. Now, of course, you might be thinking, isn't Charlemagne a French king? Well, that's not quite so simple. Much of Charlemagne's empire included what is now modern day Germany, what was known as East Francia or Francia. And so consequently, what became modern day Germany was really basically the eastern portion of Charlemagne's empire. So it was extremely influential. So as you can see, it is relatively clear, very easy to read, even to the present day. All right, Emma, next slide. But then we see the appearance circa 1150 to the 16th century of what we call Blackletter or Gothic, named after that time period. Remember, Gothic was an insult. The Goths were a large Germanic tribe that invaded the Roman Empire, and Italian humanists used the term Gothic as an insult for being uncouth, uncivilized, etc. So again, this was focused on simplicity and ease of copying. So this was basically designed for the use of a quill pen and would be very easy to write very quickly. Now, this is written in Latin, so I wouldn't expect you to necessarily be able to read this unless you read Latin, but all of the letters are all very easy to discern from each other. There's not really a lot of extra little tails or anything on them for the most part. They're all very simple. All of the little crosses and so forth are very simple and very logical. And like I said, this is analogous to Fraktur type, which we'll see in a little bit. All right, Emma, next, please. So like I said at the beginning, humanist minuscule is from Italy, and it's very much a reaction to what they believed were earlier type, or I should say scripts, that were seen as barbaric and old-fashioned, and particularly Francesco Petrarch, who was seen as sort of the humanist literary founder of the Renaissance, laid out this new script as a way of creating a script that was very beautiful and very easy to read. And you can look over there on the right. Again, that's in Latin. But you can see that all of the different letters were very easy to read, very simple, and there was no room for confusion about what each letter would be. And this is very important because there was a lot of across the Alps, cross-cultural fertilization, we might call it. And so consequently, German script creators and type font creators sort of developed a little bit of a inferiority complex. And once they saw this humanist minuscule script, they adapted their own script to sort of address this much more elegant Italian version. So Emma, next slide, please. And that is when we see the appearance of Kurrent, which basically means flowing. We have the word current in German, or in English, excuse me. This one lasts for a very, very long time. It's also very much looks like cursive. This is technically did not go, if you read books about, script in German, they'll say that this died out in the early 20th century. That's not true at all. My personal German friends, they still write in this style. I can tell you by receiving letters from them written in English that they still write in this style of script. It was still being taught, I would say, much later, perhaps maybe more so in Bavaria than in other parts of Germany, but it's still very much a way of writing that is common with many Germans still to this day. So this very much, like I said, was developed out of an inferiority complex to that humanist minuscule. And as you can see here, again, it's all about making letters that are distinguishable from each other, where there's no risk of people mistaking a letter for another one. So every letter is very nice and clear, very much looks like cursive in our own English. All right, next slide, Emma. But ironically, that came underneath criticism as well. So we see in the early 20th century, in 1915, we see the appearance of what is known as Sütterlin, which was created by Ludwig Sütterlin, hence the name. This developed, actually, it was commissioned by, I believe, the Prussian Academy of Sciences. And it was basically created as a way to simplify Kurrent. And as you can see over there on the right, it's relatively simple, but as you can see, in my opinion, I think a lot of the letters are maybe a little bit more difficult to read. But however, it was officially adopted by the Kingdom of Prussia, which Prussia made up 2/3 of the land area of the German Empire, which existed from 1871 to 1918. So consequently, it was hugely influential on the learning styles and the script style of German students during that time period. So you can see how that style is over there on the right. All right, Emma, next slide. So then, this is where it gets very interesting. Of course, the German Empire ended in 1918. It became the Weimar Republic. And then, of course, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took over. War broke out in 1939. And something interesting happened. In 1941, Adolf Hitler orders a complete reform of both script and, as we'll see in a little bit, the type fonts of the Third Reich. And over there on the left, you can see they order the teaching of what becomes known as Normalschrift, which is, in my opinion, actually very similar to the cursive that I actually learned back when I was in second grade. Now, the question is that why exactly did he do this? And the official public reason that the Nazi Party issued for why they did this is that they argued that those earlier scripts and type fonts were too Jewish. And that obviously is very disingenuous because we simply know from the history that's well documented of these different scripts and type fonts that they actually were created by Christian German, intellectuals and printers. So that just doesn't make any sense. In reality, what we think is that Hitler and his officials, as they conquered various countries like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, they actually began to sort of think, wait a minute, they're using all these much more modern fonts and scripts, and it became very complicated and difficult for Germany to be using these much more old-fashioned and sort of idiosyncratic type fonts. And switching over to Normalschrift and what we'll see in a little bit, the new type font, actually kind of eased a little bit of the transition between these different occupied countries and Germany. So sort of an interesting political reason for why they switched over. It's actually very interesting. Like I said, I don't know any of my German friends who actually write in Normalschrift. They still are very much more they are much more beholden to the Kurrent style of writing. All right, Emma, next slide. So let's get to type fonts. And, you know, I think it's very important to realize that, like most things that might just seem kind of, just things that people do for common sense reasons are still at the end of the day very heavily influenced by politics. And the reason I show you this giant triumphal arch, which was designed in part and printed by the great Nuremberg painter and printmaker Albrecht Dürer, is that with type fonts, politics played a huge role as well. While people might claim that they were doing it, for simple reasons, just doing the right thing, in reality, politics played a very important role. So next slide, Emma. So the first one we're going to be looking at is textualis, which is actually from Latin. And this was the one that Johannes Gutenberg used for his Gutenberg Bible. And you can see an example of it over there. And that is, in fact, in Latin because they were not printing in German yet. It's also known as Gothic bookhand. And as you can see, it's sort of similar to that Blackletter that we had seen earlier. Kind of, in my opinion, a little bit more difficult to read. But again, in general, the letters are pretty clear. I can tell what those words in Latin are. I think the most common one, and this is sort of a famous one that I've known for a long time, it's the same in English as well. You always have to look out and make sure that when you see that what looks like an F, it's actually an S. I think that's one that I think you all probably, everybody knows about, that famous archaic S that actually looks like an F. I think that's very well known by a lot of people. For example, in that line, you count down 5 lines and then count, let's see, it says autumn, we're a two asset Eustace. So what looks like 2 F's, that's actually ESSET, and then it's Eustace, not Ooftus. So like that's actually, those are S's right there. So that's something you always need to look out for, is that when you're seeing too many F's everywhere, check and make sure that perhaps those are actually S's. That's common throughout many different European languages and type. All right, Emma, next slide. And then we see the appearance of Schwabacher, which is simply named after a city in Germany, Schwabach. And that evolves from textualis. And this is extremely, from a historic standpoint, very important. And you can see example of that type font over there. That was used for Martin Luther's German Bible. So if you perhaps, have a Bible from the 16th century that is, a Martin Luther Bible, that very well could be a Schwabacher. We're not going to dwell on it very long, however, because it was not used for very long. You can see it over there on the left. Again, it's pretty similar. Again, watch out for the F's that look like, the S's that look like F's. So it was only used for a short time, and you can see it over there. That is a good example, though. However, it is actually in German. And finally, I can see findet auch in den. Can't see the next word; it's a little too small. But just for example, it's actually finally in German after all these centuries. All right, next slide, please, Emma. And then it gets to Fraktur, which is sort of what I might call stereotypical German text, which you see everywhere. It was created by the order of Maximilian I, House of Austria, or Habsburg, as we call it nowadays. This is what is so important for you to become comfortable using. Now, I'll openly admit, when I'm reading Fraktur type, I have this JPEG that has, it's like a key. It's actually very similar to what I'm showing you down on the left. I won't pretend like I have the Fraktur type alphabet memorized in my head. I can recognize 95% of all the letters at first glance. But take, for example, the letter F and the letter S. Do you guys notice how close those are to each other? The lowercase f and the lowercase s, the only difference between the two letters are there's a little bit of a dot sticking out from the letter F, and the letter S doesn't. So if you're looking at an old newspaper where perhaps the printmaker of the newspaper didn't quite keep the printing press completely clear or clean, you might not be able to tell if that's actually an S or F because there's a little bit of schmutz on, on printed page. But it's so important. And like I said, Albrecht Dürer in 1550, he lays it down in this gigantic print that you saw at the beginning of this section. This lasted over 400 years, if you can believe that. And that's important to realize because you might be thinking, well, that's in Germany, right? Well, guess what? It was used in German American newspapers. Whenever I have to go to German language newspapers here in America and it's written in German, I still have to know how to use Fraktur type. So this is of incredible importance to familiarize yourself. I think for the most part, if you kind of just think about Fraktur type as sort of squiggly versions of the letter, you can kind of always tell which letter everyone is. I would say the letter S, the capital letter S, is the most difficult. You might notice I did say earlier, you might not necessarily see an umlaut over capital vowels, but they do exist. But like I said, even though they are down there at the bottom, don't always plan on them. Now, the good news is that the S set looks like it looks like a B, right? But you know that obviously the fractured capital B is much more distinct and might be said to be a little more grandiose than a S set. So next slide. So what's a real world example? So in my research of the Lemp family, which the Lemp brewery here in St. Louis was a brewery that started practically, I'd say 20 years before Anheuser-Busch got its feet wet. Adam Lemp was the founder. It was founded in 1840, maybe 1841 by Adam Lemp. And he had two business partners, Louis Bach and John William Keckel. And Keckel, I couldn't figure out, I knew from probate records that he died in around 1853. But for the life of me, I could not figure out what had happened to him. I looked in the books from the coroner here in St. Louis City. They still exist going all the way back to the 1850s, but I couldn't find his name anywhere. It didn't make any sense. So I went to newspapers.com and I kind of assumed that if anybody was going to talk about his death, it was going to be the German language newspapers. And eventually, using my ability to read Fraktur type, I was finally able to track down and find a newspaper article about his death. And what had actually happened is that he had actually died out in the countryside outside of St. Louis, but he didn't have any identification on him. So the authorities had buried him in the potter's field. And 2 weeks later, his friends and family, that he had been missing. So they looked him up in the coroner's reports and they found somebody listed as a John Doe wearing the same clothes as what he had been wearing when he went missing. And they put two and two together and they figured out that this missing man was actually their missing, husband and friend and business partner, John Keckel. So that's a real world example where being able to read Fraktur type was very important because his name was not going to come up if I tried searching for it. It was basically hidden from me. So I had to go through it. And actually, this is what's really interesting. Do you know how I actually found it? I searched for the German word for dead body. And I put that into newspapers.com for 1853 for the newspapers in St. Louis. And I just searched through and I read every single story about them finding any kind of body found out in the middle of nowhere or in the city of St. Louis. And then I finally made a hit on them finding his body out in the commons of St. Louis City. So that's my spiel. And Emma, I think you take it away from me right now.
Yeah. So that's the end of the webinar with a very colorful example at the end of how we've used this. So again, Backlog's the name of my company. We do genealogy research and then other family history projects. So our next webinar is What's Your Damage? So it'll help you if you work in an archive or if you have family history materials and you might think they're moldy or have mildew, will help you identify, you know, also sometimes we've gone over different types of like bug damage to paper. So it'll be pretty interesting. If you're interested in any other of our webinars, we have a YouTube channel. Our most popular webinar is this it's related to that revolutions in 19th century handwriting. It was like how to read like different kinds of handwriting over time. And so this is kind of the German version of that. So if you're interested, it's on our YouTube page, right? And if you have a question, feel free to unmute. We don't have a chat tonight, so you do have to unmute if you have a question. Alternatively, you can email us at hello@backlogarchivist.com.
I love questions, so don't be shy.
Yeah.
This is Linda. I'll ask one. So you were talking about the different letters, like the one where it was like 5 lines down and over, but I couldn't quite follow and see which word you were talking about. Is there any way we can use the mouse and identify that area? Because I was a little confused with
Sure.
that.
What thing I was talking about, the S's that look like F's. Yeah, Emma, could you go back to that slide? There's a bunch of them back.
Do we
Keep
pass
going.
it?
Yeah, keep going.
This
Keep
guy?
going. Keep going. Wait, crap. I know what, oh yeah, keep going. Well, no, it wouldn't be that far. Huh. I know which one you're talking about.
Was it this guy?
Next one, maybe. No. Was it in the type font or the?
Yeah, that one there. That one there.
Oh, okay. So Emma, what you do is you go down 6 lines and then go down 6 lines. Yes, that word right there. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah. So is she on the second paragraph area or the bottom line of the first paragraph?
Bottom line of the first paragraph. Yes.
Okay.
So I know from just knowing Latin was my minor in college, I know from context that what those look like as 2 F's are actually 2 S's. And also, do you see how there's no little dot to the right? That's how I know those aren't F's. So that's S-it. And so like, see right up above that word, that's spiritu. And yeah, exactly. Emma, you have it right on there. The little green ball was on it. So that's another great example of, it looks like an F, doesn't it? But it's actually an S. Does does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. And now I can kind of see what you were talking about, because I was looking, I was going, I don't know where he's talking about because I don't read Latin. So I was like, I'm lost.
I completely understand, because yeah, it can look, and it makes, if you think like those are, if you think those are F's, it makes it all just look like this complete nonsensical jumble. But then when you start thinking of those as S's, the words start coming together. But then you see the word spiritu. If you go over to the right, it looks like an F. Well, there it actually is an F. Facto, which is that's the supine version of the verb facere, which means to make. So how's that for nice and confusing? Those 2 letters look identical. In one place, it's an S. In the other place, it is in fact an F.
Yeah, that's why I didn't take Latin, but thank you.
Well, when you take Latin, you use the Roman alphabet, so you don't have to worry about those things.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Oh, great question, because that can be such a nightmare to have to worry about, particularly in Fraktur type that continues on. Like I use that example where the difference between F and S in Fraktur type is literally a dot of ink the size of the tip of a pin, like a sewing needle pin. That's how small the dab of printer's ink is, the difference between an S and an F.
Tobias, did you have a question? I saw you turn your camera on.
Yes, please. So, I wanted to know, like, you said that there's like a lot of German heritage in the region, like I'm based in St. Louis, like in like Missouri, Illinois. Like, how much are we talking? Like, what percentage of like the materials that you're dealing with, for instance, are like in German, especially older German?
Um,
So I think a lot of our clients, at least, their families are German. And then they came to St. Louis and then moved westward. But I will let Chris take that because Chris's whole thing is like German brewing in St. Louis. And so he does a little bit more German research, like on the whole. We just more work with the genealogy records. And they're not necessarily
yes,
in German in St. Louis. You're tracing that family back to Germany, or you're getting letters and then they're in German.
yeah.
But
So
all
that's a great question. I mean, I'm obviously biased since I'm working with a German American family. So logically, like I gave that example of the guy, John William Keckel, dying. It was very logical that I was going to find him in a German American newspaper because that was German American interest, right? Um, and yeah, the population of St. Louis in the 1840s, I think, was at one point like 1/3 German because there was just this gigantic swell of immigration from Germany in the early 1840s, 1840, late 1840s, 1850s. One thing though, I would want to mention, if you're doing research on any type of history in St. Louis before the Civil War and after the Civil War, German language newspapers, in my opinion, tend to give a better report. The founders of the newspapers in the German language were much more professional than, say, the Missouri Republican, which was an English language newspaper. I find the German language reporting to be much more thorough and better. So even if you're not researching a German American subject, let's say you're even just researching the Civil War in St. Louis, I find their recounting of events for somebody just even like studying a non-German topic to actually be superior than the English language newspapers. So that's why it's actually valuable to consult things that are written in German in St. Louis.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I didn't know that the German newspapers were so widespread, especially.
Yeah,
Thanks.
there were three, and it's kind of weird. They changed names and stuff, and they stop for a little while and they start back up. There's the Westliche Post, Anzeiger des Westens, and there's a third one whose name is escaping me right off the top of my head. They're all very easily accessible on newspapers.com, and if you like using microfilm better, they're all available in the genealogical room at the Central Library in downtown St. Louis.
Thank you.
So I've got another question for you, Chris.
Sure.
Of all of the translators and that are out there, Google Translate, I know you can put it into OneNote, you can put it into several other programs and have those programs translate a German language into English. Which one have you found is the best or most accurate translator?
I feel like that Google has really come a long way. I've tested it before. I've taken words that have very nuanced meanings and I've put them into Google Translate, and it's done pretty darn well. And it's free, and it's already part of your Google suite of options, I guess you'd call it. So I would say you're safe with Google Translate.
So, for example, this one that we have on the screen, how would I get that to even know what those words are into Google Translate? I mean, because the letters, I don't even know what half of them are. Because I know some of the times you can put a picture of what you like. I could take a picture of this and put it in, and it would
Oh, I didn't know you
translate.
could do that. Really?
Yeah.
Well, so this is Latin, and Google Translate has a Latin translator. I don't know if I've really ever experimented much with the Latin translator on Google. Latin is a much more subjective translator. Well, how should I put this? Languages like German and English are active speaker, listener, passive, and Latin is passive speaker, active listener. Have you ever heard of that concept? So to translate Latin, there's a lot more room for how variability to individual personality or individual education about how you would translate something. You could put 10 different people who have, background in Latin together, and their translations could be wildly different, while you maybe put 10 people who know German together and their translations would be much, much similar, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But I think, I think you could actually probably, with your knowledge, well, like I said, I mean, it's pretty darn, I mean, you really need to know. I really feel like you need to take a little bit of kind of rudimentary Latin and German to be able to know. Like, for example, like this example is in Latin. You would need to know kind of when it's an F and when it's an S to be able to know how to do this, I think is important first step. I mean, yeah.
And so what we kind of explained this was easier because it was in English, but in the webinar that we did last summer was if you can identify which kind of type it is, you can look at a
Yes.
key, and then you can at least
Yes.
identify what the letter is and then maybe put it into a translator. So it's
Yes.
a lot of legwork. But
Yes.
kind of this is just an overview of different scripts and then typefaces. So just to kind of help you then recognize them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Did I hear someone else have a question?
Yeah, hi, this is Craig Harmon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So I was going to actually make a comment about the piece that we have on the screen right now.
Yes.
A mild correction. Those lines that you have over the vowels are actually being used to substitute for N's and M's, depending on what they're abbreviating in order to fit it better into the space. So what you said was facto is in fact sancto. So de Spiritu Sancto, of the
Oh,
Holy Spirit.
yes.
So and then it goes on, Joseph autem vir eius cum esset justus et nolet. That's New Testament. They're talking about the generations of Jesus, and it's repeated 3 times as you go down.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And then as far as Latin in Google Translate, to answer, I'm afraid I've forgotten the woman's name. Part of the problem with Google Translate is that, like a lot of the artificial intelligence, it's trained on multiple samples. And good Latin samples, well, as you know, the historical corpus of Latin is actually kind of small. And so there's not a lot for the AI training to work off of. That's one of the reasons that I personally find it's really weak in Latin and a lot stronger in modern languages where the corpus is huge. So, could you put this in and have it recognize it? If you could get it into the right letters first, probably because it's biblical. But other than that, I wouldn't necessarily trust it.
All right, great. Thanks, Craig.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig.
Let's go ahead and go on to Karen's question if you have a question.
Thank you. Not so much a question as maybe just to point out some resources that might be helpful to your audience that are genealogists.
So why don't we go ahead and put those in the comments on the YouTube? But if anybody else has a question, we can answer questions, but any other discussion, let's save it.
Jennifer Crane here. I had a question. Chris, you mentioned, you were talking about doing your German newspaper research on newspapers.com. Have
Yes.
you found newspapers.com to, have fairly accurate translation of the German? Was it the Gothic font that you said was commonly used in German language newspapers?
So yeah, so newspapers.com doesn't translate it for you.
No. I mean,
What's the print face? Like, what's the typeface that we use?
obviously you're typing in German word. You're searching for German words, yes. But is their system reading the German type correctly?
Yes. Okay, yeah, Jennifer, that's a great question. So I searched by the German word for dead body, which is Leiche, and it found dozens of correct identifications for that word. So somebody wrote the computer code to be able to recognize letters in Fraktur type. It's not perfect though. It was enough to come up with the gruesome story of them finding John Keckel's dead body, luckily enough. But I was pretty amazed. I was impressed that it was able to do that. But don't ever consider it to be foolproof.
Sure. Have you used other newspaper archive databases, or primarily newspapers.com?
Primarily that one. There's another couple whose names I forget. Here in St. Louis, it's the Post-Dispatch, and it was with newspapers.com. And then they went and jumped off to another company for some unknown reason. So I've been having to use that one. Honestly, newspapers.com, at least for St. Louis history, I can't guarantee in other parts of the country. In St. Louis history, it has all the ones that I need personally.
It usually depends on who newspapers.com is contracted with.
Yes.
So a lot of the local libraries, at least here in St. Louis, sent their microfilm to newspapers.com. And so that's why it's so major in this region for research.
And these are out of print newspapers. These German language newspapers kind of petered out by World War I.
Okay, thank you.
Great question.
Yeah. And I'll send everybody a link to this when we do post on YouTube, and then you're welcome to post any resources or discuss any kind of other comments in the comments on that. Because that's a really good place where we can put resources where we can link to them and people can actually click on it. Because it's really hard to convey URLs verbally. But so I look forward to everybody's comments. And thanks to Chris for putting this on. So I hope everybody has a good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great questions and comments.
Yeah.